Round number 2 of the Candidates Tournament 2016, and I'm going to take a look at the game Sergey Karjakin against Hikaru Nakamura. So let's dive right into it. Karjakin with the white piece, start with d4, knight f6, c4, e6, and we have the Queen's Indian here, b6, and now the main line. Karjakin goes for g3, bishop a6, and this is all very well known. b3, bishop b4 check, black provokes bishop d2 because the bishop is slightly less well placed on d2 than it is on c1, because as we'll actually see in the game, the bishop oftentimes is well placed on b2, and obviously from d2 it takes him a little bit longer to get to b2. Now the bishop retreats to e7, now bishop g2, and here the old main line and the move that has been played the most is c6, which prepares d5. And now bishop c3, d5. The main difference to what we'll see in the game is that if now white takes on d5, black can take with the c pawn and keep the pawn structure symmetrical. So usually white doesn't do that because it doesn't give white anything. In the game, however, Nakamura played the more fashionable choice here, d5. And here Karjakin took on d5 right away. Now black has to take back with the e-pawn. Well, knight takes d5 or queen takes d5 would theoretically also be possible, but not very advisable for black. And this creates a whole different situation. The pawn structure is quite different now, and what we'll see later on, the big question is whether black is going to play with c5 or keep the pawn on c6. Castle, castle, knight c3, and here Nakamura chooses a slightly rarer move, knight bd7. The two most played moves are rook e8, very logical move to put the rook on the half open e-file, or bishop b7 makes also a lot of sense. The bishop has done its job on a6 and can retreat to b7. And in fact, oftentimes the knight doesn't develop to d7 here, but develops to a6. And black plays with c5 or c6. The knight finds this route here to come to e6, which is oftentimes a very good square for a knight, and we'll see actually this knight appearing on e6 in this game as well. Knight b7. Now, in most games in this position, white has played knight e5, which is a very logical move to put this knight on his good square on the e5, and then black reacts with bishop b7, and it goes from there. But maybe Karjakin didn't necessarily want to see what Nakamura had prepared, or maybe Karjakin was familiar with this position already and just decided to develop the queen to c2 and play natural moves and do not go for the most played move, knight e5. Rook e8, rook f d1, knight f8, and now once the knight has retreated from d7, now Karjakin plays knight e5. Obviously there's the threat knight c6 now in the position, and knight shouldn't be allowed to come to c6, so black plays bishop b7. And now we see this maneuver that I was talking about earlier, the bishop on d2 not doing much. So the bishop is regrouped and goes to b2 now. And this position is very much a position in which both sides maneuver a lot. And there's no direct play, it's very positional. But in general, honestly, personally I always prefer white in these positions, because it seems a little bit easier to play. It seems white has this pressure, has this unpleasant knight on e5. And it's not clear how black will play. Bishop d6, and now e3. If white was a little careless here and played the rook to c1, which would be a natural move, then there's knight takes d4, a little tactical position of course. Players like Karjakin do spot these tactics with their eyes closed, so he played e3, protecting the pawn on d4. And by the way, in all of these positions, black really never wants to take on e5. And now you can also see why the rook is placed well on d file. If black at any point in time chooses to take on e5, then immediately the d file is opened up. So this really never works. And the rook is also well placed on the d file if black, as in the game, decides to play with c5 at some point, because once again then immediately the rook is on the right file. Now Nakamura played a6, preparing c5. The question is if maybe black instead should play with c6, but it's rather passive too. I can understand, especially a player like Nakamura who likes to go for active positions. That was not his preferred choice here, to stay passive. And like I said before, black has difficulties to really initiate his play and find ways to become active. So Nakamura played a6, taking any knight b5 ideas out of the position. And now knight e2. Karjakin is already anticipating the c5 move, which is coming now. And the knight is not very useful on c3 anymore, and is going to other place, and also this opening up the c file. And once again we have this knight c6 idea in the position, so it's kind of forcing black to play c5. And now d takes c5. Another very typical motive in the position that I just want to show you, which was also possible, is knight c4. It's something just to keep in mind in these kind of positions, making use of the fact that the bishop on b7 is unprotected, which is why black should not take on c4. Bishop takes b7, rook a7, bishop c6, and if the white bishop doesn't have a counterpart, white has really good chances. Now, instead after knight c4, black would retreat the bishop probably, and then d takes c5, and knight takes c5 is necessary here. B takes c5 would run into bishop takes f6 already, and queen takes f6 answer with knight a5, and black is losing the pawn on d5, and it's clearly worse. And this is really what I was talking about. Once black becomes active and tries to open up the position with c5, suddenly all these pawns become like loose, and there are a lot of ideas for white. So instead black would need to take with the knight here, and then knight f4, white is increasing the pressure. Very comfortable for white. I'm sure Karjakin spotted this variation as well, but he probably rather decided to place his knight on d3 instead of c4. So he took on c5, knight takes c5, and now knight d3. Now Nakamura played knight c4. If black takes on d3, this really more so helps white. Queen takes d3, and we have this typical isolated pawn position. The isolated pawn is the pawn on d5, and white has excellent control over this pawn, can attack it in various ways, and very, very pleasant position for white. So knight c4, rook ac1, rook c8, queen b1, queen e7, and bishop d4. And this whole position is just so easy to play for white and so unpleasant to play for black, because once again, no counterplay. What is black going to do? Just going to sit passively and defend, more or less. There's nothing else black can do. Also notice how well the knight is placed on d3. Very controlling a lot of squares, and also defending a pawn on f2 just in case there are any sacrifices. The knight can always just take back on f2. So rook takes c1 played. Rook takes c1, now b5. b5 is another concession. Maybe bishop c5 instead. But like I said, it's just not going to be easy. It's going to be a very long game, and black is going to suffer most of it. I can tell you that much. Especially when you're playing against absolute top players, like Karjakin is one of them. They don't let loose. They don't let you escape out of the grip. So it's really not a pleasant position to have against any top grandmaster. So Nakamura played b5 and now b4. Good move by Karjakin to fix the pawn structure here on the queen side and also to get control over a c5 square. And we see this bishop is just terrible on b7. Knight d7, so now there's some maneuvering going on. a3, just securing the pawn on b4. The knight is coming to e6 here. Now bishop a1. Obviously there are many ways for white to play here. Another possible way to play was knight ef4 and keep the bishop on d4 for now. I like the bishop a lot on d4. But like I said, white has many ways and none of them really spoil his position. So bishop a1. Karjakin wants to open up the d4 square for the knight, which also makes a lot of sense. Knight e6, queen a2, bishop c7, and now knight d4. Bishop b6. And here Karjakin decided to expand a little bit on the king side, and actually there's a direct idea associated with this. He wants to play knight f5 without black having the option to go queen g5 in return. So this is why I played h4 to prepare knight f5. And here Nakamura miscalculated and sacrificed a piece. He won back the piece, but as we'll see in the process, he loses another piece, so that just didn't go well for him. Probably necessary is to take everything on d4, and it remains a painful situation for black because of the terrible bishop on d7. Let's make this a red bishop. Really unpleasant, but you can try to defend and put up as much resistance as possible. And white still has to prove how to win this position, but clearly white has all the chances here. Instead, Nakamura played knight takes g3, and it just doesn't work, and it is honestly quite surprising to me because the line to calculate is not so complicated, and it was not so difficult to see that this doesn't work. So we'll see in a moment what happens here. White just takes. Now knight takes d4. Bishop takes d4. Bishop takes d4. E takes d4. Queen e3 check. So this is what Nakamura relied on, attacking the knight on d3. And the knight cannot go in between because of queen takes c1. But maybe this is the move Nakamura missed, queen f2. And the difference to any other move is that now after queen takes d3, white has this double attack here with rook c7, attacking both the bishop and obviously queen takes f7. And well, there's just nothing black can do. Black can give a check here, but it just doesn't change anything, and it's lost. So a simple calculation error here, it seems, by Nakamura just cost him the whole game, but we have to remember his position was already difficult, and I'm not sure what the time situation was. I don't think it was a factor, but psychologically it was already difficult for him, and it seemed he just wanted to break out of this passive situation, but it just didn't work out. He played a few more moves here, but the position is just completely lost. f5, rook takes b7, h6, bishop takes d5 check, and Nakamura just retreated back to g2. Black cannot initiate any attack here with his two pieces. Rook e2, and then simply bishop f1, very cool finishing move, and Nakamura resigned because the exchange of queens is more or less forced. If rook takes f2, bishop takes d3. White is just up a piece, so nothing to do here anymore. Very clean, very convincing performance by Karjakin. who simply outplayed Nakamura out of the opening, got a more pleasant position and maneuvered, and then Nakamura just made this calculation error and lost without a chance really. I think the main reason for his loss was really to be found in the opening, because he chose this line, this setup where black is rather passive and it's easier to play for white. At least this is my understanding. And it seems it didn't quite suit Nakamura today. Alright, so since this was the only decisive game today, Karjakin now is in a shared lead together with Anand. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you again some other time. Goodbye.